I was having a conversation a couple of weeks ago with my friend Richard, and he was recently on a business trip to the Middle East, and he was in Abu Dhabi, which is the capital of United Arab Emirates. And he was telling me a story. He said as he was touring the city with a friend of his who was showing him around the marketplaces and restaurants and other places, the call to prayer went out because UAE is a Muslim emirate. And so the call to prayer went out, and they were by this structure called the Grand Mosque. You can see a picture of it on the screen behind me. And the Grand Mosque is an intricate piece of architecture. And he said his friend who was from there, who was with him, said, yes, we're allowed to go in. There's a couple of things you need to be aware of, but come on in. You're welcome to come in. And so they were able to go in during that prayer time. And he was told a little bit later on by this friend, this mosque was actually designed as a place of worship for anyone to come and worship. It wasn't just designed as something centered around the Islamic faith, the Muslim faith. And I actually went online and I checked out a little bit more information about the Grand Mosque. And this is what the visitor's guide actually says. It talks about that history. It says, Sheikh Zayed Grand Mosque is one of the world's splendid, iconic architectural wonders that highlights the tolerant nature of the Islamic culture and promotes cross-cultural communication amongst different cultures, successfully positioning itself as a leading destination on the tourism map. Talks about how millions of people from different cultures visit this mosque every year in the region, and how even its architecture illustrates notions of dialogue among cultures. In other words, when it comes to this particular place and the idea behind this structure, in a few words, worshipers are welcome there of different faiths. I want to use that as an illustration to kind of segue into what Jesus is presenting today. When it comes to Jesus and when it comes to God, he would have that same perspective. Worshipers are welcome. If you're interested in worshiping God, he doesn't want to try to put barriers up between you and the worship. Now, this is in contrast to what was happening at this point in time in history. In first century Judaism, there were actually a lot of barriers that prevented people from getting too close to God. Depending on certain health conditions you might have or certain cultures that you were born into, things beyond your control, you may or may not be allowed to approach God. Or you may be allowed to only come so close to God. And yet Jesus, in his teaching, he's really shifting the mindset of people because for years and years, centuries, only certain people were worthy enough to get close to God. And so Jesus is going to redefine that. And eventually, through his death on the cross, he's going to pave a way for anyone, anywhere, to come close to God and worship. And he's starting to set those principles and outline those principles through the way that he interacts with people, starting now in chapter 8. So that's what we're looking at today. Our topic is worshipers are welcome. When it comes to Christ, he wants people to have access to worshiping God. So we're going to look at a few different individuals that he encounters on the way down from the hillside after the Sermon on the Mount, going into the city of Capernaum to illustrate this truth, and to look at the different kinds of barriers that separate people, maybe even separate us from worshiping God today, and how Jesus wants to pull those barriers out of the way. And the first thing we're going to take a look at is someone with a specific condition that prevented, in this case, him from worshiping God. It says in verse 1, when Jesus came down from the mountain, large crowds followed him. So people want to keep hearing from Jesus. They're not done yet. They've listened to this large bulk of teaching on the hillside, but they're still enamored with Jesus. And so they're just following him down to see where he's going next. It says, right away, a man with a serious skin disease came up and knelt down before him. He actually prostrated himself. And so he put himself down, kneeling before Jesus on the ground, and he approached Jesus. It says a serious skin disease. The word that some Bible translations use is leprosy. Now, leprosy is, we call it Hansen's disease today. It's a specific skin disease caused by bacteria. And at this point in time in history, there wasn't a specific medical diagnosis for leprosy necessarily. It was one of many skin diseases, and there was a blanket term, lepros, in the Greek language that covered all these different skin diseases. So we don't know what kind of skin disease this man had for certain, but it was something that kept him from associating with people. He was on the outside. He was an outcast from society, and he comes up and he kneels before Jesus. And so he has this disease, contagious disease, that he cannot control, can't control. And sometimes people today, many of us maybe, we have conditions that are beyond our control. And in this man's case, it was getting in the way of his worship. Another thing to note about him, people who were considered lepers or affected by contagious skin diseases at this point in time in Jewish culture, they were isolated from contact with their whole community. They had to live on the outskirts of the community. They had to warn people at a distance when they were approaching. And so this man is breaking protocol by coming up to Jesus. He should have stayed far away and shouted at Jesus and told him of his condition, but instead he's just so much in need of, we'll see in a moment, I believe, being connected with God, that he has to come and he has to approach Jesus. Maybe he's been eavesdropping on the Sermon on the Mount from a distance, but he is desperate and he needs to come to Jesus. And so he approaches him and he says, Lord, in the next phrase, if you're willing, you can make me clean. Now, I think this should stand out to us, because if I were him and I were coming up to Jesus, I would say, Lord, if you're willing, you can heal me, right? And so why does he say, if you're willing, you can make me clean? His greatest desire, it's not necessarily just to be healed, it's to be clean. Clean at this point in time, it was a religious reference. And it means accepted into the community of worshipers. It means allowed to enter into the temple in Jerusalem and worship God. And there were different conditions that would make people unacceptable to approach God in the Jerusalem temple. Some of those conditions were temporary. Things like if you had touched a human corpse, maybe someone in your family died and you're preparing the body, you had to go through a cleansing process. There was a delay and a period of time where you were not qualified to come and worship God. Maybe it was certain bodily discharges that you would experience with your health, or a recent childbirth, or you had eaten a meat that was unclean or that was not killed in the proper way or prepared in the proper way. All those things would make you for a while disqualified to come and worship God. But in addition to these temporary exclusions, there were actually conditions that would permanently isolate you from worshiping God. There's a document that was written around AD 200, and so a little bit after this, the next century after Jesus walked the earth. But it describes a lot of the rules that the rabbis and the Pharisees, the religious teachers and scribes, they followed and they had the community follow in the 1st and 2nd centuries AD. And here's a small excerpt from that, and it tells us some of these other groups of people that were excluded from worship. And it's specifically talking about people who were not commanded to go up to worship, but the implication is these people are kept at a distance. They're kind of excluded from worship. And here's the list. It says, all are subject to the command to appear before the Lord. So certain times of the year when certain feasts happened, certain groups of Jews, they were commanded to appear before God in Jerusalem, except, here's the exceptions, if you are deaf and mute, you're not expected to appear before God at the temple, because culturally we know you're not allowed to come before God. That's a barrier. If you have some sort of if you're a person with a learning or a disability, you're not allowed to come before and worship. If you're a child, you're not allowed to come before God and worship. This is from the Mishnah. If you are a person, the term is of doubtful gender. So if there's any question about your gender or the ability to clearly identify your gender, you cannot come and worship. If you have physical elements of both genders, which people do even today, they were excluded. And this is not laid out in the Old Testament. This is something that was Jewish tradition, right? If you're a woman, you're excluded from coming to worship, at least closely. You can come in a certain court, but you can't go beyond that. If you're a slave that has not yet been freed, you can't come to worship. If you're lame or blind or sick or too old to walk up to the temple, which is uphill in Jerusalem, you can't come for worship. And so all of these people are on the outside, right? And this man, because of his sickness, he's on the outside. He's ritually unclean, and there's nothing he can do about it. So he doesn't come to ask just to be healed. He wants to be clean. He wants to have access to worship the God of Israel in Jerusalem, because he knows that these barriers are in place because of the religious leaders' traditions. And so he can't go up to worship. And so it says in verse 3, reaching out his hand, he touched him. Now, it's not that the man with the skin disease reached out and touched Jesus. It's that Jesus reached out his hand and he touched the man with the skin disease. This is a contagious skin disease at a time in history when there's no cure for this contagious skin disease. And the word literally in the Greek language, it's not that he reached out and touched him, because for us we would think, well, first of all, I don't know if I'd want to touch that person, right? And if we did, it'd be like we'll touch you at a distance. This word is actually to cling to someone. And so Jesus reaches out, and it's this idea that he just embraces this man or grabs his shoulders, and there's contact. Maybe for the first time in years that somebody actually responded by reaching out to him and physically touching him. And it says, Jesus said, I'm willing, be made clean. I don't want this to be a barrier between you and coming to worship the true and living God. Of course I'm willing. Be made clean. And it says immediately his disease was healed. Jesus clings to him and his disease is healed. And I think one of the big reasons why Jesus stepped in and healed his disease is because that was the barrier at this point in time. That was what was preventing him from coming to experience worship. And so Jesus took it out of the way because he wanted this man, and this man desired for himself to have access into the community of worshipers. And I think it's fitting for us to kind of pause and think about that. God reaches out to people who are unclean, people who are excluded in different ways. And I think in our culture, maybe we wouldn't have a note on our church door that says you're not welcome here if you're experiencing these things, but maybe we tend to keep certain types of people at a distance. For example, maybe there's somebody in your life that does have a communicable disease of some sort. I think about some time that I spent in Africa about 10 years ago, and we're constantly in more rural villages, and even in those rural villages, there are many children who were born with AIDS. And so the tendency is to, keep people at a distance. And I remember that the people who had the most successful experiences on those trips were the people who, when they stepped into that world, they flipped off a switch to be worried or concerned or thinking about who has AIDS and who doesn't have AIDS. And they just started picking up children and holding them and greeting people and shaking hands and embracing people and just setting that aside. That's in God's control, but I'm here to love these people. But yet sometimes it's hard. Our tendency, maybe our first human reaction, is to keep people at a distance. Maybe it's persons with disabilities. We're uncomfortable. We don't know how to communicate. We don't want to push them beyond their physical limits. And so we just kind of keep them at a distance when it comes to our relationships or our friendships. Maybe it's people who are incarcerated or who are stuck in some sort of maybe a routine in their life that makes us really uncomfortable. And so we keep them at a distance. Maybe it's people who are despised by different segments of society. And Jesus, in his day, there were people who were labeled as sinners. Not that everybody didn't do wrong things sometimes, but there were people who were categorically sinners. Like if you're a tax collector, like you're kind of beyond hope. We don't associate with you, the Jews would say. Or other people, people who were prostitutes, things of that nature. So there were different sins in their society that would keep people on the outside. And maybe there are people in our society that, maybe the majority or certain segments of society or even religious cultures say, we don't approach those people. Yeah, Jesus, he's breaking that because he wants all types of people to gain access to worship of God. He wants to pull the barriers out of the way. And I put here on your notes, true worship is unhindered by inability. I think that's important. And at this point in time in history, again, you had to go to the temple in Jerusalem to worship the true and living God. But a few years later, Jesus was going to dynamically shift that. And we get a clue with the woman at the well in the story in John chapter 4 that Jesus tells this woman, because he goes up and he's talking to a woman who's a Samaritan. She's already excluded from temple worship because she's considered half Jewish and half Gentile, and she's a woman, so she can only get so close anyway, and all those things. And Jesus says there is a point in time that's coming where you're not going to worship people here in Samaria, and you're not going to have to go to Jerusalem because you're going to worship God in spirit and in truth. And Jesus is working toward that, where these physical barriers to getting access to the Jerusalem temple, they don't matter anymore. Because now, worship, it's unhindered by ability. It's offered in spirit and in truth. You can be anywhere in the world, and you can take a moment and step aside and begin to talk with God and have access to him. And so these conditions that prevented people, Jesus is in the process of removing and pulling out of the way so that people everywhere, anywhere can gain access to worship God. And again, he would finish that and complete that road to God through his death on the cross for sins and providing that way of uniting us back in our broken relationship with God by faith. Jesus continues this conversation. He says, see that you don't tell anyone. So I've just healed you. Don't go telling lots of people, but go show yourself to the priest and offer the gift that Moses prescribed as a testimony or a witness or an evidence to them, to the priests at the temple, of your cleansing, that you've been healed, that you're okay to come here and worship now. And so that's interesting too. Jesus not only wants this man to make some conclusions about worship and to have the opportunity to worship God at close distance again, but he wants the priests in the temple to learn a few things about worship also and to come to some conclusions from healing this person. And here's a few of the conclusions I think that are intended, the witness, the testimony that Jesus speaks of that I think they're supposed to get. One, this cleansing, it was caused by God. There are only two other places in recorded history where people have been cured. And it's only one Israelite and one person from Syria have ever been cured in this manner from a skin disease of this nature. Okay? It didn't happen. There was no natural remedy. There were some tree saps and things that were used to put on it, but they were only like treating the symptoms and not treating the cause. There's no way to take away these skin diseases at this point in time in history. No medicine, no medical treatments to completely cure this at all available. It had only happened twice. Both times were miraculous. One was when Miriam opposed Moses and God struck her with leprosy. Moses prayed and God took the leprosy away. The other one was when Naaman the Syrian was told by his servant girl to approach Elisha the prophet, and Elisha said, if you dip in the Jordan River 7 times, you'll come out clean. God will heal you. He said, the Jordan River is kind of dirty. I don't know if I'm going to do that. But his servant convinced him, go do what God, the man of God says. He did it, and God miraculously healed him. And so the first thing the priest would realize is this is an act of God. This is not natural. This is supernatural. God did this. And so it would cause him to do the next thing, to investigate the circumstances. Well, if this is an act of God, how did this happen? Guess who that's going to point him to? Jesus, right? And so they realize, the previous 2 times this happened, it was at the hand of Moses and Elisha, 2 of the greatest prophets in Jewish history. And here's Jesus. So what level does that put Jesus on? And not only that, Moses, through God, 1 person was cured of the skin disease. Elisha, 1 person was cured. Guess how many lepers in the New Testament we have record of being cured? 12. And there may have been more, there probably were. So think about the 12th time a leper comes to the priest in the temple and says, I've been cured. What does that teach these priests about Jesus and where he's at as a representative of God? And I think it causes them to wonder, maybe Jesus is the Christ. Maybe he's this Messiah figure that we've been told about all along. Maybe he's finally here. Because books like Isaiah would talk about the healing that this Messiah would accomplish. And I think it would cause them to start doing some mental gymnastics and looking into this a little bit more deeply. There's also some symbolism between the different rituals that they would perform at the temple when somebody was cleansed. Just to put this in a very kind of succinct, minute-long way, they would take a couple of different birds and they would sacrifice one bird and take the other bird alive and dip it in the blood of the first bird and then release that bird. And some people believe that these birds ultimately were placed in the Old Testament to be a picture of Jesus, how his blood was shed, he died, but at the same time he raised to life and would ascend into heaven. So maybe that's a picture of Jesus' death and resurrection. Also, there was scarlet thread that was involved. And you would put scarlet yarn or thread around the firstborn child. It was associated with holiness in the tabernacle and the temple. Different garments and elaborate fabrics were woven with scarlet. The priest's garments had scarlet. Salvation of Rahab's household in the Old Testament, she hung a scarlet cord or rope out of her window, and that's why she was saved. Luxurious clothing was formed with scarlet, and also sin was associated with it. And so if you take things like a firstborn child and holiness and priestly garments and salvation and luxury and yet sin, you start to see some different pictures rise to the surface, right, about maybe where this man was at and what place God has now brought this person to. And so there are a lot of lessons that the priests might have gained if they look a little bit deeper and they consider what's happening. That was this man, his condition. Then Jesus encounters someone else. And the thing that separates him is not his condition that's beyond his control. It's actually the culture that he was born into. He's not Jewish. He's of another nation, of another ethnic origin, of another culture. And at this point in time, the Jews had the idea that if we're Jewish, we are far superior. We're the people with the connection to God. And I mentioned about traveling in Africa briefly a few minutes ago. Another thing, I think one of the sad things that I experienced in the part of East Africa that we were in is that people had, over time, I think they had been taught this years, decades previously, maybe centuries previously, and so it was kind of an ingrained thought that was in their minds. But to them, somebody with a lighter skin tone was automatically more intelligent, more wise, a better source of spiritual truth and information. Somebody with a darker skin tone was less qualified to speak on spiritual things, give you advice, tell you wisdom. And that was the cultural perception. And I think it was as a result of colonization in the couple of centuries previous to being in those countries. And that was a sad thing to me, because it was this idea of if you're of one culture, of one skin tone, of one geographic location, especially if you're American, you're automatically elevated above other people. And so we'll listen to you, we'll take your advice above others. And it was kind of in that way similar in the Jewish culture. It was if you're Jewish, you're on a pedestal, you have a close access to God, you know spiritual things, and if you're not, well, you're kind of over here. And so this man perceived himself as lesser spiritually, as lesser qualified, as not welcome to worship God. And we'll see in just a moment who he is. It says, when Jesus entered Capernaum, so Jesus comes into the city. This is his home base for a lot of his ministry. Capernaum means village of comfort. Isn't that a fitting city for Jesus to base his ministry out of, right? His hometown now is the village of comfort, and he is the source of it. Here's a few pictures. This is what Capernaum looks like today. It's an aerial view. It's on the north coast of the Sea of Galilee in northern Israel. So this is the archaeological site. Here's a little bit of a closer up view. These are some of the buildings, foundations of buildings and things like that that were present closer to Jesus' day. You can go to the next slide. This is a synagogue. It's from the 3rd and 4th century, so 2 and 300s AD. Probably the tendency was to build synagogues on previous synagogues' foundations, and so chances are the synagogue where Jesus taught in Capernaum was probably right underneath where this structure currently that we see is or was. Last one, this is an olive press that existed in the town, so just a few visuals. Again, it's changed a little bit over the last 2,000 years, but just so you can see kind of where things are at. But that's this village of comfort, and it says, when he entered into this place, this town, a centurion came to him pleading with him. So a centurion, in case you're not up on your Roman military history, a commander of 100 soldiers in the Roman army came up to Jesus. Luke, in his gospel, gives an account of this same story, and Luke sheds a little bit of light on some details. It wasn't necessarily that this man approached Jesus, but this man sent people to approach Jesus on his behalf. First, he sent some Jewish elders to come up and approach Jesus, because again, this guy is not Jewish, and he sees himself as inferior spiritually. God's got me at a distance. I can't even approach Jesus. So he sends some of the Jewish elders from the village out to approach Jesus. And then eventually he sends some of his servants out to approach Jesus because he sees himself on the outside. And Jesus, again, wants to take that barrier of culture out of the way. This is the message he sends in verse 6. Lord, my servant's lying at home paralyzed in terrible agony. We know from Luke's account, about to die. So on his deathbed, Jesus says, I'll come and I'll heal him. That's what he tells the Jewish elders who were sent. That word servant, in the Greek language that the New Testament's written in, it's actually a little more specific. It's actually child. We know from Luke's account, he was his servant as well. That term for slave is also used. But it's a slave whom he considers his precious child. This is somebody very deeply very emotionally attached to the centurion and vice versa. And he sees this person who's very precious to him, maybe even younger, being tortured by some kind of paralysis. Don't know if it resulted from an injury or a sickness or possession or what it came from. But he's tortured, he's in agony, and he's about to die, and this person is so precious to the centurion. In verse 8, it says, "Lord," the centurion replied, "I'm not worthy to have you come under my roof." So he sends out his slaves with this message. "But only say the word, and my servant will be cured. Because I too am a person under authority. I have soldiers under my command. I tell this one, go, and he goes. I tell that one, come, and he comes. I say to my slave, do this, and he does it." So the centurion says, "I understand how it works. I'm also under authority. Like, I'm not worthy to have you come under my roof. So if you just give a command, I trust that my servant will be healed, that you can restore this precious one to me." So he says, "Jesus, can you command this healing at a distance? Because I'm not Jewish. I can only get so close to God." And this isn't a guy who hasn't done anything. Luke's account says that the Jewish elders who first approached this man, they actually think this man is worthy to have Jesus heal his servant, because they say he loves our nation and he built our synagogue. So on the foundations, probably underneath that synagogue you saw a few moments ago, was a first century synagogue that was actually built by this centurion, financed by the centurion. So he loves these people. The Jews think he's worthy, but he doesn't think he's worthy because he's not Jewish. He can't approach God, at least only from a distance, not closely. This is what Jesus says in response. Hearing this, Jesus was amazed, and he said to those following him, "I assure you, I haven't found anyone in Israel with so great a faith. I tell you, many will come from east and west, and they'll recline at the table." This is the imagery of a great banquet, of a feast. "They'll sit back at the table with Abraham and Isaac and Jacob in the kingdom of heaven," or in God's kingdom. What he's saying is, this man has impeccable faith. He's got more faith than the Jewish people, not only in Capernaum, but everyone Jesus has encountered throughout the nation of Israel. All of these people who have free and open access to the temple, Jesus says this man's faith is greater than all of those individuals' faith. And the implication by saying many will come from the east and the west, and they'll be a part of this banquet in God's kingdom, the implication is Jesus is saying this centurion as well will be at this banquet. He is a part of God's kingdom. So Jesus is confirming his citizenship in God's kingdom. And as he's been teaching about God's kingdom right before this in the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus is saying, this man, he is worthy. He believes in me. He knows who I am. And he will be a part of the kingdom of God. He is a part of the kingdom of God. And he'll be a part of this banquet someday. He is worthy to worship. He didn't perceive himself as that way, but Jesus is saying the cultural difference, that's not a barrier. I've come to remove that. Jesus says, finishing up his comment here, "But the sons of the kingdom will be thrown into the outer darkness. In that place there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth." Sons of the kingdom were the people who are Jewish. So you're born into the Jewish nation. You've got the right culture and the right pedigree, and you have instant access to the temple. Jesus is saying, how ironic. In contrast, many people who are born into God's nation, these Jews that can access the temple in Jerusalem, they're actually not going to be a part of this banquet. The term outer darkness, it describes if you have a banquet at the king's palace or a fancy wedding feast, at night there are lamps in the building where the feasts are. As the feasts go into the night, they're lit with oil lamps, and so it's bright and it's light there. But outside it's very dark because this is first century Israel, no street lights or anything of that nature. And so it's either very light or you're on the outside and it's very dark. And it's a way of Jesus depicting that these people, although they were born into the nation of Israel, they haven't come into God's kingdom. They won't be at that banquet. They'll be on the outside. Where there's weeping and gnashing of teeth, weeping has to do with sorrow. Gnashing or grinding or gritting your teeth has to do with anger. It's a depiction of anger. And so people who are, on the outside, they thought their culture was enough, but they never came to God through Jesus. They never entered into God's kingdom. at some point will find themselves on the outside, and the reaction will be sorrow and anger that whatever they had, their culture, their works, all these things, they weren't enough. They'll be mad that God wouldn't take that as enough. I'm Jewish. How dare you exclude me from your kingdom, God? But Jesus has taught that's not how we enter his kingdom. Jesus says he's the way into the kingdom. And so that just shows that again, these barriers of culture, even things that we put in the way, culture shouldn't prevent us from worship. I got to watch my time, but there's two final things, different areas that can prevent people, and I think they prevent people in our day and age as well from worshiping God. And so I want to just kind of very quickly go through those things. I won't share a lot of extra stories or illustrations because I want to be mindful of your time, but the third aspect of things that separates people from worshiping God oftentimes is confinement, being in a position of confinement. About 3 weeks ago, I had COVID, and so I was in isolation for 5 days. I was separated from people in my own household and separated from social engagements, those kinds of things. And sometimes you have things in your life that come into your life that put you in a place of confinement. Maybe it's temporarily, or maybe it's more long-term. Maybe it's some of our church family are going through cancer treatments and things. You have to be very careful when your immune system is taken out of the picture, or chronic illnesses that are very similar. So maybe it's periods of time, maybe it's a lifetime where you feel confined in different ways. And it says in verse 14, when Jesus went into Peter's house, his house was in Capernaum, he saw his mother-in-law, Peter's mother-in-law, lying in bed with a fever. And she's just hot. Her head is burning up. And we know from the next verse, she'd rather be out taking care of Jesus and taking care of Peter and showing hospitality to everyone that's there, but she's sick in bed and she can't move. She's been thrown in bed by a fever, is the picture behind it. It's limiting her from worship through serving people. And it says in verse 15, so Jesus, he touched her hand and the fever left her. And then she got up and began to serve him because that's what she wanted to do all along. But yet this thing that was confining her, that was limiting her, had been preventing that all along. And I think it's, again, as I'll talk about in a moment with our application, maybe you're feeling limited or confined, but maybe there are ways either to move past that. Maybe it's okay for a time to be limited and just to accept where you're at and that you can't fully serve. There'll be a time when God takes that away. Or maybe there are creative ways to work around your confinement and still find ways to serve even though you are confined in different ways. The last wall that kind of was a barrier between people and worship was control. Control is something, I think of something that's outside of us, that's got kind of a hand on our life in different ways. It says in verse 16, when evening came, they brought to him, to Jesus, now it's night in Capernaum, many who were demon-possessed. So they have these evil spirits in them that are controlling various aspects of them in their lives. It says Jesus drove out the spirits with a word and he healed all who were sick. And so Jesus casts out spirits who are interfering with people's ability to follow Jesus. And according to the New Testament, there is a reality that there is a spiritual warfare. God has an enemy. He is called Satan. Satan has other angels who have fallen, who are helping him try to counter God's plans. And so perhaps sometimes the reasons why people's worship is limited is because there's this interference or there's this influence supernaturally in someone's life. And I would say that prayer probably is the best way to counter that. If we suspect that that's the case, maybe it's a family member or a friend or a loved one, and we think that there might be more than just the physical realm involved in separating them from worship. I think prayer is probably the greatest thing that we have to be able to start to counter that and to pray that God will step in and remove that barrier. It says in verse 17, so that what was spoken through the prophet Isaiah might be fulfilled. He himself took our weaknesses and carried our diseases. So sicknesses, the possession, all those things is kind of lumped into this category from Isaiah of weaknesses and diseases. And the idea is Jesus carries away, or he carried away weaknesses of soul related to spiritual issues, oppression, things like that, but also weaknesses of the body. And sometimes our weaknesses get in the way of worship. And so maybe it's physical healing that we seek treatment for, or we pray for healing from, or maybe it's weaknesses of our soul. Maybe even things like routines or addictions or habits get in the way. But our soul is so anchored in those things that they prevent us from worship. And so maybe we seek support, encouragement, effective routes to escape that, prayer, because all those things can still work their way into our lives even today to be barriers to worship, but Jesus wants to take them out of the picture. I don't necessarily have A, B, C steps to suggest that you follow in response to what we've talked about today, but I have some questions. And so if some of these questions are questions that maybe God speaks to your heart and you think that's a challenging question, I want to think through that and see where I'm at or see how that impacts me. Here's some questions I think we might ask ourselves as a result of what Jesus has shown us today, what God has taught us, hopefully. First question, are we as a church, and I don't mean the building, I mean as a community of people who follow Jesus, are we as a church more focused on excluding people from worship or bringing people access to worship? Because the Jews in the first century, I would say, were pretty focused on keeping people away from worship. And so what is our focus? Is it, let's see how many barriers we can put between people and our relationships with them and bringing people into worship? Or is it, how can we give people access to worship? Second question, how accessible are we to people affected by conditions beyond their control? A lot of times people who have these different conditions they can't control, people are very isolated. And so how accessible are we to people with, again, things like disabilities or contagious even physical conditions or people who are despised by our society? How much access do we give those people to our lives? Third, do we view people of every culture as equal? Because God does. The centurion was just as acceptable as a worshiper as the Jewish person who had grown up in that culture and had the right pedigree and the right ancestors. So how do we view people of different cultures? Are they equally invited to worship God? Does God love them equally? Do we love them equally? What can we do to bring opportunities for worship to people who are confined in different ways? Again, I sat down with somebody in a rehab center this week, and they were stuck in a room that's 10 by 10 with a TV with, some local channels on it, just sitting there. And so when we're confined or we're going through these months-long health recuperations or chronic illnesses or things that last for years and years and years, are there things that we can do to worship? And are there things that we, maybe who aren't confined, can do? Can we go visit people and help them figure out or help facilitate different things to help them be more involved in worship? Do spiritual forces seem to be interfering with someone's ability to follow Jesus? If they do, maybe we should pray. Are there ways that we can provide support for people who are affected by times of weakness? Weaknesses of their soul, weaknesses of their body. There are things that we can do. One encouraging opportunity that's been made available, we're going to start hosting an AA group here, I believe. At least that's an option for women. And so maybe that's something that you have experience with as well. Maybe it's in a different, in that same vein, or maybe it's in, maybe it's a men's group, or maybe it is a totally different subject, but it's something where, things have control over people. How can we help support as a church or as individuals, people whose worship is hindered in those ways? And so all that, God might speak to you or might speak to me and give us some further direction with those kinds of questions. But let's go ahead and pray, and I'll let you guys go. I know it's been a few minutes longer today, so thanks for your patience. But God, we appreciate learning from you. And Jesus, you constantly challenge us each week. When we look at you, we can't help but learn something. And I thank you that you are trying to bring people into worship of you, not exclude them from it, and help us to also be able to step into that process of encouraging people and also becoming a space here where people are invited in to experience worship. Help us to ultimately follow your lead and your example in this area. In Jesus' name, amen.